frankly, we should be spending more on our army. And there are lessons from history to show that if we don't, we stand in danger.
The government says that it's putting £5 billion more into defence over the next 2 years. The plan is to increase defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP. But when that will happen is not clear. Joining us now is former Chief of the General Staff, in other words, the person who runs the army, and crossbench peer Lord Dannatt. Good morning to you.
Asma, good morning.
These two figures then, £5 billion over the next 2 years, increasing defence spending by up to 2.5% of GDP. That last one has been argued over for years now. Do they sound about right to you or not?
Well, 2.5% would sound right if actually the government was committing to it now. If we recall the discussions over the last 2 or 3 weeks, Ben Wallace has been arguing between 8 and 11 billion pounds. If we were to go to 2.5% of GDP, we're talking about between 12 and 15 billion pounds extra. So the government, by coming up with 5 billion, has met a third of what most analysts believe we need to be spending on our defence to be credible, both to play our part along with the Americans and the Australians, and that's a big deal for the Prime Minister at the present moment with regard to Indochina and Indo-Pacific, but also to play our full part in European security. And that's the area that I am still most concerned about.
So what do you think informs the government's decision? Is it just purse strings?
Yes, purse strings, of course, must come into it because there's a lot of pressure on the government's finances at the present moment. I fully accept that. If you look at where the 5 billion extra is going, part of it is going, and quite rightly, to pay for replenishing the ammunition stocks that we have given to Ukraine, and that's right and proper. A lot of the rest of it is going to the nuclear industry and new aspects of our nuclear deterrent capability, and to assist with the AUKUS deal, which the Prime Minister has gone to California to discuss with the Americans and the Australians. So that's fine as far as it goes. But, and this is the big but, with a land war in Europe, our land forces, our army, is woefully underinvested and underfunded at the present time. Everybody knows that. The army has taken the lowest priority in spending terms for quite some time to come. So a pledge to go to 2.5% of GDP is good. But my question is when and what will that extra money be spent on? And I would say this because I'm one of the blokes that used to run the army. Frankly, we should be spending more on our army. And there are lessons from history to show that if we don't, we stand in danger.
I mean, you mentioned that a land war in Europe, that's somewhere that we will never fight directly.
Well, Asma, your crystal ball is clearly rather better than mine. I would certainly hope very much that we don't. But then we've said that in history in the past. We've also said that a land war in Europe in the 21st century is unthinkable. But oh my goodness, for the last 13 months, we've got a horrible one going on that's consuming tens of thousands of lives and billions of pounds of money and smashing up a European country. So I'm afraid that is a land war in Europe. Now, the critical thing is we want to prevent a further land war in Europe or a further widening of this land war in Europe. And that comes about if our deterrent posture is strong enough to deter, in this case, Vladimir Putin's Russia, or indeed the Russia of whoever comes after him, from wanting to expand their influence in a malign way in Europe. And we will only do that by having strong defences ourselves. Defences that we hope not to have to use, but if we haven't got, then we can be rolled over. And history shows that.
What about the situation you mentioned, your concerns over in Indochina? I mean, the government, well, I don't know. What do you think the government is taking that sufficiently seriously?
The government is taking it sufficiently seriously, and it has to be, and I think is being sensibly nuanced about the approach that the UK takes. Rishi Sunak is keen that we don't talk in terms of China being a threat. And to an extent, that is right, although they do threaten us in some ways. What we have to do is to treat China as an aggressive competitor. And with a competitor, you compete. And we absolutely do need to compete, both in commercial and industrial terms. But they are a threat insofar as we have allowed so much Chinese influence on our manufacturing, communications, and many other parts of our economy, that their tentacles, if you like, go pretty deep into our economy. And that is dangerous. Now, what's going on in San Diego today is an important meeting between the Australians, the Americans, and the British over this nuclear submarine deal, and that is part of making sure that other interests are strong enough to compete against an increasing Chinese competition. And I stress the word competition rather than threat, because I think at this stage that is how it should be viewed, not a threat. We don't want to get into armed conflict with China. That, to be honest, I can only see that coming about if the Chinese were unwise enough to attack and try and capture Taiwan. But I think that's a discussion for another day. So we need to compete with the Chinese and not regard them as a threat of conflict.
Okay, Richard Dannatt, thank you very much. Former Chief of the General Staff and crossbench peer, Richard Dannatt.